Picture this. It's 1935. A farmhouse somewhere in rural Saskatchewan. Outside, the ground is cracked and gray. The wheat is gone. The harvest failed. Again. But inside that kitchen, a woman is feeding 6 children. Not with a full pantry, not with a grocery list, with 3 ingredients. Maybe 4 if she was lucky. And the meals she made weren't scraps. They were strategy. She knew things about food that most people today have never been taught. How to pull calories from almost nothing. How to make fat taste like flavor. How to turn yesterday's leftovers into tomorrow's dinner. And then she passed those skills on. And then her daughter passed them on. And then somewhere along the way, we stopped listening. Today, we're going to remember. 30 meals, 30 stories. All of them built on 3 ingredients or fewer. And some of them are more nourishing than anything you'll find on a menu today. And before we get into them, if stories like this matter to you, the forgotten meals, the old ways, the knowledge people used to carry in their hands, subscribe to the channel, because we're bringing that history back, one story at a time. Number 30, fried bread scraps. Let's start somewhere simple. Somewhere almost embarrassingly simple. Because that is what this whole list is about. In farmhouses across Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, when bread baking day was over, there were always scraps, little torn pieces, leftover dough that did not make it into the loaf. Most people today would throw those away without a second thought, but not back then. Those scraps went straight into a pan, with whatever fat was available. Lard, most often. Sometimes bacon grease. And those rough, irregular little pieces would hit the heat and puff up. The outside would blister and brown. The inside would stay soft and airy. The whole house would smell like a bakery. They would dust them with a little salt, maybe a pinch of sugar if there was any, and that was breakfast. 3 ingredients. Dough scraps, fat, salt. Nothing revolutionary, just nothing wasted. And that was the entire philosophy behind every meal on this list. Number 29, boiled molasses pudding. Nova Scotia had molasses the way other places had sugar. It came in barrels, off the ships, dark, thick, intensely sweet. And when you had a barrel of molasses in the cellar, you used it for everything. This pudding was one of the oldest uses. Just suet, flour, and molasses, wrapped in a cloth and dropped into boiling water, left to cook low and slow for hours. The result was dense, dark, intensely sweet, almost like a steamed cake. On a farm in Cape Breton, where you might be outside clearing ice from the barn doors at 6 in the morning, that weight in your stomach wasn't a problem. It was the whole point. 3 ingredients, 1 pot of boiling water, a meal that kept you going until dark. Number 28, potato and onion soup. There's a version of this story in almost every province. In Quebec, they called it soupe au jardin. On the prairies, it didn't have a name. It was just what you made when it was cold and there wasn't much left. You take potatoes, you take onions, you take water. That's it. In the best versions, there was a knob of lard or butter. In the hardest years, there wasn't. The potatoes go in rough chopped. The onions soften into sweetness as they cook. And the starch from the potatoes thickens the broth on its own. No cream, no flour, no seasoning beyond salt. And yet, something happens in that pot. The sugars from the onion caramelize just slightly. The potato starch makes the broth silky. The whole thing becomes something that tastes far more complex than 3 ingredients have any right to produce. Pour it over a heel of bread if you had one. Eat it straight from the bowl if you didn't. Either way, nobody went to bed hungry. Number 27, oatmeal and lard cookies. This one surprises people every time, because when you say the word cookie, people think butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, chocolate. But in the 1930s in rural New Brunswick, a cookie was a luxury made from whatever was available. And what was available was oatmeal, lard, and maybe a little sugar, rolled together into rough little balls, pressed flat on the pan with the heel of a hand, baked until they browned at the edges. They weren't soft and chewy. They were dense and crisp, almost like a cracker with a hint of sweetness. But for a child, in a one-room schoolhouse, pulling one of these from a tin pail at lunch, it might as well have been a treat from a bakery, because comparison wasn't the point. Joy doesn't require perfection. It just requires something made with care. Number 26, salt fish in Brewis. On the coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador, salt cod wasn't a specialty. It was the foundation. Before refrigeration, salt cod was one of the only proteins that could survive months without spoiling. Fishermen would bring it home in thick, stiff planks that had to be soaked for a day or two before cooking. Combined with hard bread, also called brewis, that had been soaked overnight, and scrunchions, small fried cubes of salt pork, gave you a complete meal. Protein from the fish, carbohydrates from the bread, fat from the pork, everything a working body needed. Fishermen ate this before heading out onto the water at 4 a.m. 3 ingredients, 1 tradition, a whole culture built on the sea. There's a German and Ukrainian influence that runs deep through the prairies. And one of the things those communities brought with them to Manitoba and Alberta was the practice of eating rendered lard on bread, not butter, lard. Carefully rendered from pork fat, strained, seasoned with salt, sometimes stirred through with cracklings, the crisp little bits left behind, spread thick on dark rye bread. That's it. No garnish, no ceremony, just fat and bread and salt. On a farm in 1928, where you were burning calories from dawn to dusk, that fat wasn't a problem. It was fuel, dense, efficient, long-burning fuel. And the taste of it is something the grandchildren of those settlers still talk about. Number 24, cornmeal mush. In southern Ontario and parts of Quebec, where corn had been grown for generations before European settlement, cornmeal was everywhere. And mush was the most basic thing you could make from it. Cornmeal, water, salt, stirred constantly over heat until it thickened into a smooth, creamy mass. Served hot in the morning like porridge, poured into a pan to cool and set at night. And then in the morning, the cold, solid slab would be sliced and fried in fat until golden, crispy on the outside, dense and warm inside. You could eat it sweet with a drizzle of molasses. You could eat it savory with a sprinkle of salt. Either way, it fed a family for pennies. 3 ingredients, 2 meals out of 1. Number 23, wild berry jam on bread. Summer in Canada is short, brutally short in some parts of the country. But for about 6 weeks, in July and August, the land becomes enormously generous. Wild blueberries in the Maritimes, Saskatoon berries on the prairies, wild strawberries in Ontario's fields. Grandmothers knew exactly where to find them, and they knew that every jar of jam put up in August was a luxury saved for December. Berries, sugar, a little lemon if you had it. Often you didn't. Cooked down until thick and dark and jammy, poured into jars, sealed with wax. And months later, when the snow was high and the pantry was nearly bare, you'd open one of those jars, spread it on bread, and for a moment, it was summer again. That's what jam was. Not a condiment, a time machine. Before refrigeration, before grocery stores, before anything resembling modern food infrastructure, you'd put up a barrel of salted pork in the fall and live off it all winter. Combined with potatoes, which stored brilliantly in cold root cellars, you had a meal that required nothing else. Cut the salt pork into thick slices. Fry it until the fat renders and the edges go brown and crackling. Toss in rough-cut potatoes. Let them cook in that rendered fat until soft inside and golden outside. No sauce, no herbs, just pork, potato, and rendered fat. Honest, heavy, necessary, built for bodies doing real physical labor in real Canadian winters. Number 21, bread and milk. This one is so simple it barely seems like a recipe. But ask anyone who grew up in rural Canada before the 1960s and watch their face change when they hear the words bread and milk. It was what you gave sick children. It was what elderly grandparents ate when their teeth were gone. It was what working men came home to when there was nothing else. Just bread. Stale was fine. Better even. Torn into a bowl. Hot milk poured over. A pinch of sugar. Maybe a whisper of cinnamon if you were lucky. The bread would soak up the milk and become soft and yielding. The warmth filled you immediately. In the deepest poverty, this was dinner. And the children who ate it didn't know they were poor. They just knew it was warm and that someone made it for them. Number 20, cabbage and fatback. Ukrainian and Polish settlers brought this knowledge to the prairies, and it took root fast because cabbage grew everywhere, lasted all winter in a cold cellar, and cost almost nothing. And fatback, the salted fat from a pig's back, provided everything the cabbage didn't. You'd fry the fatback first. Let the fat render slowly. Then shred the cabbage in and let it cook down in that fat. Low heat, long time. The cabbage would wilt and soften and turn from sharp and bitter to sweet and silky. Season with salt. Caraway seed if you had it. Serve it alongside bread or over boiled potatoes. 3 ingredients at their core. A dish that traveled across an ocean in someone's memory and kept an entire generation alive on the Canadian prairies. Pattern break. First, something worth pausing on, because we're only at number 20, and already every single meal on this list has something in common. None of them are about taste first. They're about understanding. Understanding how to pull energy from inexpensive ingredients. Understanding how fat and starch and salt work together. Understanding that nothing gets wasted. Our grandmothers and great-grandmothers weren't bad cooks. They were scientists, working without a laboratory, without a cookbook, without a safety net. The next 10 meals are where it gets even more interesting, because the constraint gets tighter, the ingredients get simpler, and somehow, the meals get better. Buckwheat grew well in the cold, which made it perfect for Quebec, Northern Ontario, and the Maritimes. It's not technically wheat at all, it's a seed, which meant it was tolerated even in regions where grain harvests had failed. The pancakes made from it were dark, almost gray, denser and earthier than anything you'd make with white flour. Buckwheat, water, a pinch of salt, mixed to a batter and dropped onto a hot, greased griddle. The smell was nutty and deep, eaten with molasses or maple syrup, or just with a scraping of lard. They were filling in a way that white flour never quite managed. Something about the density of buckwheat kept hunger away for hours. Farm families in Quebec could work all morning on 2 of these. Number 18, pea porridge. This predates Canada as a country. Split peas, dried and stored, were one of the most stable foods in a settler's pantry. They could survive years without spoiling, and they were packed with protein and fiber in a way that stretched meals dramatically. Split peas, water, salt, cooked long and slow until the peas dissolved entirely into a thick, creamy mass. No herbs, no broth, just the peas themselves. The result was beige and plain and deeply, deeply satisfying, served in bowls with bread sometimes poured into a mold to cool, and then sliced and fried the next day, much like cornmeal mush. 2 meals from one pot, nothing wasted. Again. Number 17, apple and oatmeal crumble. Apple trees were everywhere, along the edges of cleared fields, behind farmhouses, along fence lines. They required almost no attention and gave enormous returns. And in the fall, when you had more apples than you could eat fresh or store whole, you made crumble, apples, oatmeal, a little brown sugar or molasses. The apples peel on, sliced rough, piled into a cast iron pan. The oats and sugar spread on top, a knob of lard dotted across the surface, into a wood-fired oven. Out again 40 minutes later, with the apples soft and bubbling beneath a golden, crunchy crust. This was dessert. And on a farm where dessert was rare, when this came out of the oven, the whole family fell quiet, because sometimes 3 ingredients is all beauty needs. No list of Canadian historical food is complete without baked beans. And the version that matters here isn't the sweet ketchup-flavored tin you find on store shelves today. It's the slow, austere, magnificent original. White navy beans, water, salt pork, nothing else in the classic version. The beans soaked overnight, packed into a clay pot with the salt pork pressed down into the middle, covered and set in a slow oven, or buried in the coals for 8, 10, 12 hours. The slow heat does something extraordinary. The beans soften completely. The fat from the salt pork disperses through the whole pot. The liquid thickens and darkens, and you end up with something so deeply flavored, so rich and filling, that it's almost impossible to believe there are only 3 things in the pot. Families across English Canada made a pot of beans on Saturday, ate it Saturday night, ate the leftovers Sunday morning. 3 ingredients. 2 days of meals. Number 15, turnip mash. The turnip doesn't get enough respect. It's plain, humble, sometimes bitter. But in cold, northern climates where most root vegetables struggled, turnips thrived. They grew in poor soil. They survived early frosts. They stored all winter without a cellar, just left in the ground under a mound of straw. And mashed with fat and salt, they became something entirely different from the raw vegetable pulled from the ground. Turnips, butter or lard, and salt, boiled until completely soft, then mashed vigorously. The fat smoothed out the bitterness. The salt brought everything forward. The result was golden, creamy, slightly sweet. On a plate beside salt pork and bread, this was a meal, full and complete and warm, available right through January, February, March, when almost nothing else was. Number 14, fried dough with maple syrup. This one belongs to Quebec, though versions of it exist in indigenous communities across the country, going back far further than French settlement. Maple season comes in March, late winter. The snow still deep, and the sap runs and is collected and boiled down into something that tastes like the land itself. The dough was made from flour, water, and a pinch of leavening, torn into rough pieces and dropped into hot fat, fried golden, pulled out, drained, piled on a plate, and then the maple syrup comes out, poured over. The contrast between the hot, crispy dough and the cold syrup straight from the tin. This wasn't an everyday food. This was the first taste of spring, the first sign that the hardest months were almost over. And people ate it standing in the sugar house, surrounded by the smell of boiling sap, with maple syrup running down their wrists. 3 ingredients, one of the most joyful meals this country ever produced. Number 13, barley and water soup. Barley is one of the oldest food crops in human history. And for good reason. It's cheap. It grows in difficult conditions. It stores indefinitely. And when cooked slowly in water, It produces something extraordinary. The grain releases starch as it cooks. That starch thickens the water slowly, turning it into a broth that clings to a spoon. Add nothing but salt, and you had something that feels far more substantial than its ingredients suggest. On the prairies during the Depression, when the crops had failed and money was gone, barley soup kept families alive. Not comfortably, not happily, but alive. And sometimes, that's the whole story. Every farmyard in Ontario had rhubarb. It grows like a weed. It comes back every spring without being replanted. It requires nothing from you. And in May, when it was the first edible thing in the garden after a long winter, it felt like a gift. The stalks were sharp and sour, bracingly, almost painfully sour when eaten raw. But cooked with sugar, the whole character changed. Rhubarb, sugar, and sometimes a splash of water to get it started. Cooked until the stalks dissolved into a thick, pink, fragrant jam. The sourness transformed, balanced into something complex and almost floral. Put up in jars, spread on bread all summer and into fall. When the question was, what do we have today? The answer was often, rhubarb jam. And it was always enough. This one seems too simple to include until you understand what oats meant. Oats were cheap enough that even the poorest family could afford them. They stored well, they cooked quickly, they filled you for hours. And on a dairy farm, cream wasn't something you bought. It was something you skimmed off the top of the milk every morning. So this breakfast, oats, water, cream, cost almost nothing. And yet, it's one of the most complete breakfast foods a human can eat. Complex carbohydrates, fat, a significant amount of fiber, the kind of slow, sustained energy that carried people through manual labor. There's a reason oatmeal has never gone away. 100 years of nutritional science later, it's still one of the best things you can eat in the morning. Our grandmothers didn't need a study to know that. They knew it because it worked. Every single day. Take a moment. We're at number 11, and if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed something. Not a single meal on this list required a spice rack. Not a single one required olive oil or coconut aminos or a blender. Not one required a trip to a specialty store. The knowledge these meals represent isn't culinary knowledge, it's survival knowledge. And there's a difference. Culinary knowledge is knowing how to make something delicious. Survival knowledge is knowing how to make something from nothing. How to read a root cellar and know what you can work with. How to render fat slowly so it doesn't burn. How to make starch thicken water without flour. These skills weren't taught in school. They were handed down. And the last 10 meals on this list are the ones that were passed down most fiercely, because these are the ones that made the difference. Number 10, potato bread. At a certain point in the Depression, wheat flour became expensive enough that some families couldn't always afford it. But potatoes were different. Potatoes grew in the backyard. Potatoes stored in the cellar. Potatoes cost almost nothing. And someone clever figured out that you could replace part of the flour and bread dough with mashed potato, boiled potato, flour, salt. The mashed potato adds moisture and a slight sweetness. It changes the texture of the bread entirely, making it softer, more tender, with a thin, crisp crust. It also makes the loaf larger, heavier, more filling, and it stretches the flour, which meant one sack of flour went further, which meant the family ate longer. Simple bread, humble ingredients, smart thinking. Number 9, creamed corn. On farms where corn grew, canned corn was a staple, or corn dried at the end of the season and reconstituted when needed. Creamed corn required nothing. Fancy. Corn, milk, and a little flour or just reduction. The corn cooked slowly in the milk until the liquid thickened and the kernels softened. You could eat it as a side dish. You could eat it over bread like a sauce. You could serve it to a sick child as one of the only things they could keep down. It was mild, slightly sweet, comforting in a very specific way. The kind of food that doesn't ask anything of you, just feeds you and lets you rest. Sometimes that's exactly what a person needs. Number 8, pork and bean stew. This one crosses the line from survival food into something people actually looked forward to. That tells you it was done right. The base was always beans, navy beans, yellow eye beans, or whatever variety the family had. The fat and flavor came from whatever cut of pork was cheapest. Hocks, neck bones, even just the rind. Cooked together long enough that the collagen from the pork dissolved into the liquid, thickening it into something sticky and rich. Nothing else needed. The 3 core things, beans, pork, thyme, were everything. Poured over bread in winter, served in deep bowls on a Sunday, eaten standing at the stove on a Tuesday night when everyone was too tired to sit. Every configuration, every occasion. This stew was there. Number 7, fried egg on toast. The egg. The single most important protein source in rural Canadian history. Every farm had chickens. Every family had eggs. And when money was tight and meat was gone, the egg was what stood between your family and hunger. A fried egg on a piece of bread. That's it. Egg, bread, fat for the pan, the white crisp at the edges, the yolk still soft, placed on the bread so the yolk runs into it when you press down. This was breakfast. This was sometimes dinner. This was what you gave children when there was nothing else, and you didn't want them to know it. The egg asked nothing. It required no skill, no time, no technique. It was just honest. And in a life that was often very hard, honesty in a meal was worth more than you'd think. These are older than Canada itself. Flour, water, salt, mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, pricked with a fork, baked very slowly in a cool oven until hard, rock hard, jaw-achingly, intimidatingly hard. They were not meant to be eaten like a cracker. They were meant to be soaked in tea, in soup, in water, softened slowly until they yielded. And the reason they were made this way was simple. A properly dried hardtack biscuit lasted for years, on ships, in lumber camps, in the packs of men building the railway. Wherever work took people away from supply lines, hardtack came along. It didn't need to be kept cold. It didn't need to be kept dry. It didn't spoil. It just waited until you needed it. Number 5, dandelion and vinegar salad. May, the snow finally gone, the ground soft, and before anything in the garden has come up, the dandelions arrive, all over the lawn, all through the fields, and most people curse them. But our grandmothers knelt down and picked them. The young leaves, before the flower comes, are the best, tender, slightly bitter, packed with vitamins. After a winter of salted and preserved food, after months without anything green, those bitter young leaves were medicine as much as food. Toss them with vinegar. Add a few strips of fried bacon and the hot fat from the pan. Pour that warm, acidic dressing over the leaves and watch them just barely wilt. 3 ingredients. But the story behind them is 10,000 years long. Because humans have been eating dandelion greens since before farming existed. This is one of the oldest foods on this list, and somehow, one of the most nutritious. Number 4, bean and potato hash. The rule was simple. Nothing left the kitchen until it had been used twice. Leftover cooked beans from yesterday, leftover boiled potatoes, a little fat in the pan. Everything goes in together. Pressed down, left to brown, flipped roughly, pressed down again. The edges go crispy. The inside stays soft and creamy. Salt, a scraping of hot pan. That's it. And this hash was one of those meals where the sum was genuinely more than the parts. The potato crust, the creamy bean interior, the char at the edges. Something about it felt intentional, like someone had thought about it, even though the whole thing was just yesterday's dinner, fried. That's the thing about necessity. It produces its own creativity. And sometimes the best food is the food that starts from constraint. There's a version of this in every working culture in the world. And Canada's version belongs to the men who built it. Loggers in British Columbia, miners in Northern Ontario, fishermen in Newfoundland, men who needed to eat fast and needed to eat a lot. Thick-cut bacon, dark rye bread, mustard if there was any, fried hard, no softness left in it, edges dark and crackling, slapped between two slabs of rye, eaten with your hands. This wasn't delicate. It wasn't meant to be. It was a refueling, a physical transaction between a working body and the fuel it needed. But the smell of that bacon, the density of that rye, the particular satisfying crunch when you bit down. For the men who ate this every day of their working lives, that combination became home, became comfort, became one of those tastes that stays with you forever. Number 2, molasses and oatmeal bread. This is the bread that built the Maritimes, not the light, white, fluffy bread that came later. This bread was dark, dense, heavy in the hand. Oatmeal stretched the flour. Molasses replaced the sugar and added its own deep, slightly bitter sweetness. And salt. That's it. 3 ingredients folded into a loaf, baked until the crust was firm and the inside was tight and chewy. This bread didn't go stale quickly. It stayed moist and dense for days, which mattered when you were baking once a week. A slice of this with butter was a meal. A slice of this with salt pork was a celebration. And the smell of it baking, that molasses and oat smell filling a cold wooden house, is something that people who grew up with it never forget. Not once, even decades later, even when they're old. They smell something close to it, and they're back in that kitchen every single time. Number 1, lard and bread with salt. There had to be a number 1. And after everything on this list, it had to be this. Because this is the meal that shows up in more family stories than anything else. In more provinces, in more decades, in more kitchens. It doesn't have a formal name. It's just bread with lard and salt. That's it. A thick slice of homemade bread. Lard, white and clean, spread across it like butter. A pinch of coarse salt pressed into the surface. 3 ingredients. No technique, no equipment, no skill required. And yet, this is the meal that comes up when you sit down with someone who lived through the Depression, or who grew up on a remote farm, or who worked a lumber camp or a fishing boat, and you ask them, "What do you remember eating?" And after they think for a moment, they almost always say something like, "We had bread with lard. My mother used to put salt on it." And the way they say it, the way their face changes. It's not a description of poverty. It's a description of home, of someone who cared enough to feed them, of a time when food didn't need to be complicated to be meaningful. 3 ingredients. The most important meal on this list, because this one isn't just food. This is memory. 30 meals, 30 stories, all of them built from 3 ingredients or fewer. And if you've listened to every one of them, you've probably noticed that none of these are really about food. They're about knowledge, the knowledge of how to stretch a meal, how to use every part of what you have, how to make fat taste like flavor, starch taste like substance, and sweetness feel like love. Our grandmothers and great-grandmothers carried this knowledge through the hardest decades this country has ever faced. The Depression, the wars, the failed harvests, the brutal winters. And they didn't just survive. They fed their families every single day, without a grocery app, without a delivery service, without a backup plan. What comes next for us? Nobody knows. But maybe the most important thing we can do is remember what they knew, because food security doesn't start at the grocery store. It starts in the knowledge you carry with you. And that knowledge is still there, waiting for us, in these 30 meals, in these stories, in the hands of anyone who remembers. And if you want more stories like this, forgotten meals, lost traditions, and the practical wisdom our grandparents lived by, subscribe to the channel. And if one of these meals brought back a memory from your own family, tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear it.